can I say good evening again? It's lovely to see familiar faces. Like I said before, I loved being part of this church family for a couple of years. So it's such a joy to be back and visit. So thanks for having me. As you will have gathered, tonight we are continuing this series on women in the Bible. And this evening we're looking at the story of Deborah. So just satisfy my curiosity for a moment. Could you put your hand up, please, if you have ever heard a sermon on the story of Deborah before, just out of interest? There's like 2, 3, not many. So as I was preparing for this sermon during the week, I was thinking, I don't think I've ever heard this passage being preached on before, which I think is a shame because I think it's a pretty epic story. So if you have a Bible, whether a physical or a phone, could you please get Judges chapter 4 up in front of you and just leave it there because we're going to read a few bits as we go along. But just firstly to orientate us in the story so far, so after many years of wandering and battling and struggling, God's people have finally entered the promised land. And we might be expecting that it will all be sunshine and roses from here on in. It will be milk and honey as far as the eye can see. That is actually not the case. Because it turns out that the Israelites are actually human beings. And they are just as messy and fickle and forgetful as human beings are today. And they keep falling into the same trap of essentially trying to live their lives without God. And the book of Judges is kind of like this repeated cycle where God's people royally mess things up and then fall into the hands of some sort of tyrannical army, and then they repent and they ask God for help, and God raises up a judge, a kind of leader who will deliver them and bring about peace. And then sooner or later they mess things up again and the cycle starts all over again. So I should warn you that if you read the book of Judges, it is not the most cheerful book of the Bible. And yet, even in all the darkness, we do have a few specks of light. And there are just a few people who show us what it looks like to carry the light of God into a dark world. And I think Deborah is one of them. So let me read from Judges chapter 4, verse 1, and hopefully it's going to come up on the screen as I read. So it says, Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, now that Ehud was dead, and he was the last judge. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. Sisera, the commander of his army, was based in Harosheth Hagoyim. Because he had 900 chariots fitted with iron and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years, they cried to the Lord for help. So here we are. We're at the start of the cycle. The Israelites have messed up once again. They've done evil in the eyes of the Lord. And as always, this leads them into hot water. They get taken over by a Canaanite king and his right man Sisera, who sounds like a bit of a thug. And it's a bleak situation. When it says that Sisera's army had 900 iron chariots, that is meant to put fear in our bones. This is state-of-the-art machinery. One commentary I read said that an iron chariot could cut through foot soldiers like a hot knife through butter. Just imagine today maybe like a little rural farming community coming up against 900 tanks. You know, there's just nothing they can do to fight back. And so they are cruelly oppressed for 20 years. And for some people in this room, that is your entire lifetime, living under the shadow of these iron chariots. So it's a bad situation. And it says that the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help. I mean, no kidding. I think I would do the same. And who does God give them in response? Surely a mighty military leader. You know, maybe this battle-scarred warrior who can lead them to victory. I'm kind of imagining like Sean Bean as Boromir in Lord of the Rings, like that kind of figure. But that's not what they get. In fact, they get a prophet and a woman. So reading from verse 4, it says, "Now Deborah, a prophet, the wife of Lapidoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went up to her to have their disputes decided." So here's Deborah, and she's clearly this gifted leader, right? She's wise, she is discerning, she clearly has a ton of authority. People are bringing her their disputes to be decided. I don't know if you have someone like that in your life who's like your go-to person that you can call up and say, "Oh, I'm in a bit of a pickle. Can you help me out? Can you give me some advice?" Deborah is that, but she's for the whole of Israel. And most importantly, she is a prophet. She is highly attuned to the voice of God. And I'm gutted that we don't get more of a backstory here, because I have loads of questions about this. Like, how did she come to be a judge in the first place? How did that process work? And in a highly patriarchal society, how do people respond to having a female leader? You know, did she ever get pushback against her decisions? Did she have people coming up to her under the palm tree and mansplaining to her? I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. All we hear is that Deborah was leading the people of Israel through this dark time. And one day she hears the Lord speaking to her. So from verse 6, it says, "She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kedesh in Naphtali, and said to them, 'The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands.' Barak said to her, 'If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go.' 'Certainly, I will go with you,' said Deborah. 'But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman.' So Deborah went with Barak to Kedesh. There Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 men went up under his command, and Deborah also went with him." So Deborah tells Barak, "Now is the time to fight. Don't you worry about those 900 iron chariots. God is going to give us this victory." And Barak says, "Yes, okay, maybe, but please will you come with me?" And Deborah agrees to this, although she does warn him that he won't get the glory for this victory. But she agrees to go with him, and so they head off to the battle lines together. And just skipping to verse 14, it says, "Then Deborah said to Barak, 'Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?' So Barak went down Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled on foot." So it is exactly as Deborah had prophesied. God hands over Sisera's army on a plate. And we don't get many details about the actual battle, but what's really clear is that God is responsible for this victory. This is not clever military tactics. This is God's victory. And so we're going to leave the reading there, but if you have read this story before, you might know that there is a gruesome little epilogue where Sisera ends up with a tent peg through his head. So if you have a strong stomach, you can read ahead later, but I should warn you, it might put you off your camping this summer. So it is an epic story, right? It's an epic story about an epic woman, but what relevance does it have for you and me today? I don't know about you, I am not leading an army, I'm not leading a nation, I don't lie awake at night and worry about iron chariots. And yet, I think this story has something to say to us about courageous leadership, about how we might boldly step out in obedience and trust. But I should be honest with you for a moment and say that I am not a particularly brave person. In fact, I would say I'm naturally risk averse. I'm not spontaneous. I never go with the flow. When I'm making a decision, I like to make a long list of pros and cons. That's just, my natural disposition. And yet, the reality of following Jesus is that sometimes we have to be brave, don't we? Sometimes even just to live as a Christian in today's world can require a fair bit of courage, let alone some of the more specific things God might ask us to do. And so I'm asking myself, is there anything that we can learn from this story of Deborah about courageous leadership? And funnily enough, I think there is. And the first thing is this: have courage to take your place. Have courage to take your place. Deborah was a woman who stepped into the gifts and the authority that the Lord had given to her. She had this spiritual gift of prophecy, and she was willing to use it. She was willing to use that gift of wisdom and discernment to lead the people of Israel through this really hard time. And what's more, she did it as a woman. I was actually joking before about mansplaining, but Deborah is actually the only female judge that we read about in the Bible. She's actually not the only female prophet. There are at least 4 others mentioned in the Old Testament. But even so, Deborah is occupying a space traditionally held by a man. She doesn't fit the classic profile of a leader within that culture. And yet she steps up and she takes her place. Now, I wonder if anyone in this room, other than me, has ever experienced imposter syndrome. You know that feeling that any moment now you're going to be found out and someone is going to point their finger at you and say, you shouldn't be here, you're not qualified. I'm quite familiar with this syndrome. I would say that in every job I've ever had, in every position of responsibility, I've had this lurking suspicion in my mind that I'm actually not up to the job. And I imagine I'm not alone. I imagine most of us at some point have thought, I'm not experienced enough, I'm not confident enough, I'm not old enough maybe, or young enough. I have got the wrong background, maybe I'm not the right gender. And we can say to ourselves, who on earth am I to do this? Who on earth am I? And so I find it very encouraging that the Bible is full of unlikely people who don't quite fit the mold. Like when God calls Moses to lead his people out of slavery, Moses literally says to him, who am I to do this? And I find it very interesting and encouraging that God doesn't give him a pep talk in that moment. He doesn't say, hey, Moses, you're fantastic. You're absolutely the man for the job. Instead, he says, who are you? Who am I? I am who I am. I am the one who calls you. I think the key to so many of the great leaders in the Bible is not that they are brilliant and talented and qualified. It's that they're obedient. And they're willing to go where God leads them. Deborah was anointed by God. She'd been given these spiritual gifts. And although she might have not have looked like the leader that people were expecting, she had the courage to take her place and actually to be entrusted with the very words of God in her mouth. And I think it's important that we recognize that Deborah's authority didn't rely on herself. You know, so many leaders get themselves into sticky situations when they rely on their own great ideas or their own charisma or reputation. But Deborah's confidence didn't come from within her. She didn't just wake up one morning and think, oh, do you know what? I think this feels like a good day for a battle. Let's give it a go. But her authority came from the God that she knew and the words that he had spoken. So here's my first encouragement from the story of Deborah. Have courage to take your place. And I don't know what that looks like for you in your situation. And maybe there's something really big that God is asking you to do, some big dramatic life change. But maybe it's something far more ordinary. Maybe God is nudging you to gently shift the culture of your workplace by speaking life and truth rather than gossip and pessimism. Maybe you're faithfully leading a life group here at St. Michael's, and sometimes it's actually hard going, but you feel like God is calling you to stick with it. Sometimes we need courage for these ordinary things. I was talking to a friend a couple of months ago, and she was telling me about a situation at work. And there'd been a sort of complicated restructuring of her team. But sort of the management hadn't communicated very well, and it had a really negative impact on some of the more junior members of the team, and some people ended up resigning, all very hard. And my friend was in a meeting where all this was being discussed. And the managers were kind of patting themselves on the back and saying what a great success it had all been. And my friend, who is not remotely confrontational, she said she was sat there and she said she just felt like she had to say something. And so she spoke up in front of all of these senior managers, and she said, actually, you might not be aware, but some people got really hurt in this process. And I think maybe it could be done better in future. And she told me about that, and I thought, that is so brave. That is such an example of courageous leadership in real everyday life. So, like I say, I don't know what this looks like for you, but can I encourage you tonight to have confidence in the authority that God has given you and have courage to take your place? So that's the first thing. The second thing is this: have courage to encourage others. One thing I love about this story is the dynamic between Deborah and Barak. And honestly, I feel a bit sorry for Barak in this story, because can you imagine being summoned for a meeting with a prophet? And she says, hello, Barak, hope you're well. I've got some big news for you, and actually God has promised to give us victory over our oppressors. You know, those ones with all the iron chariots, those ones. And even better, he'd like you to be the one to lead the army. You know, I think it is actually fair enough that Barak is a little bit wobbly in his reply. And in fairness to him, he does agree to go, but he asks Deborah to come with him. And I'm just speculating here, but I like to imagine Deborah and Barak making this journey together to the battle lines. And every sort of 5 minutes, Barak saying, oh boy, I'm not so sure about this. They do have a lot of iron chariots. Maybe should we just turn around and go home? And I imagine Deborah by his side saying, Barak, it's going to be fine. God has literally told us to do this. It's going to be okay. The thing about courageous leaders is that they give courage to others. Deborah didn't just give Barak a set of instructions and tell him to crack on with it. She went with him. And it seems as if her presence was enough to help him go through with it. You know, the word encouragement, it literally just means to put courage in. And I think it's probably a hugely underestimated gift. I know for me, there have been so many occasions where the biggest source of courage for me has been someone coming alongside me. And actually, I was thinking about it this week, and I was thinking one of the people who's done that most for me in my life is actually your curate, Ellie. I've known Ellie since I was 19, and she gave me my first job working with students, which is very encouraging, and she was my first boss. And honestly, when I started that job, I was just scared of the whole world. Like, I was so lacking in self-confidence, just constantly doubting myself. But I spent 2 years working with Ellie, with her pretty much daily telling me, it's going to be okay, you've got this. And she would write me cards with Bible verses and encouragement. And over time, it had a massive impact on me. And it helped me to grow in courage. And my question for you this evening is there someone in your life who you could put some courage into? Is there someone at work, or in your life group, or in your family? It might not even mean using words. It might just be literally coming alongside them, maybe going with them to that hospital appointment that they're dreading, or dropping around with a meal, or sending them a text. I don't know what it is, but I wonder if maybe as I'm saying this right now, there's someone who's popping into your minds. And maybe you could even just put a reminder in your phone right now to follow up with them this week. And it might feel really ordinary to you, but it could be the thing that gives them the courage to keep going. So have courage to take your place. Have courage to encourage others. And then finally, have courage in the God who goes before you. There's one thing that Deborah says to Barak, which I think is maybe the key to this story. In verse 14, she says, "Go, this is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? Because, Barak, he's heading into the unknown. He is stepping out in faith, and he has no idea what is coming his way. And so he needs to hear these words from Deborah. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you? And as I was praying about this passage, I felt like God really highlighted this verse. And I felt like he gave me a bit of a picture. So I wonder if you can imagine with me that you're walking through thick, fresh snow. And it's not just like a little dusting like we get in the UK, but it is proper snow that comes up to like your knees. And you're trying to plow your way through. And it is such hard work. You're pushing against this freezing, heavy snow, and your toes have gone numb, and it is just exhausting. But do you know what would make that situation easier? Is if someone else went ahead of you. If you could put your feet into their footsteps and walk through the path that they have already made. Because doesn't it make all the difference in the world when someone else has gone ahead of you? Even as Barak steps out into the battlefield, there is one who steps out ahead of him. And it's not an isolated event. There are so many times in the Bible when God goes out ahead of his people. You think of God parting the Red Sea so that his people could have a safe path through. And then when they're wandering in the desert, they're being led by a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. There are so many examples of this. And I think ultimately we see it in the person of Jesus. One of my favorite descriptions of Jesus is in the book of Hebrews, when he's described as a pioneer and a forerunner. Jesus is the one who has gone ahead of us. He came as a human being. He came and walked through pain and grief and temptation. And ultimately, he went ahead of us into death itself. And now he goes ahead of us into resurrection life. He's the first fruit. He is the forerunner. He forged a path for us so that we could put our feet into his footsteps. And even now, he says he is preparing a place for us in his Father's house. And I don't know, maybe this evening you're facing something really daunting. Maybe God is inviting you into some sort of leadership and it really scares you. Maybe you're facing change or uncertainty, maybe about your health or your finances. And maybe you're just wondering if you have what it takes for the season ahead of you. Can I encourage you that even as you step out, there is one who steps out ahead of you? So I'm coming to a close in a moment, but I just wanted to end with a brief testimony of what this has looked like for me in the last year. Last summer, I was preparing to move to Reading to start a master's course to train to be a speech and language therapist. And I didn't know a single person in Reading. And I was feeling really quite anxious about this. And I was feeling worried, basically worried that I was going to be quite lonely in this new place. And I remember one day just this thought occurring to me, and I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if there was another Christian on my course? That would be so nice, wouldn't it? And this was just a thought. I didn't even turn it into a prayer. It was just a thought that went away. Anyway, shortly before I moved, a friend of mine said to me, "Oh, I think I know someone in Reading. I'll give you her number. She's a Christian. Maybe you could go for coffee or something." So I texted this person. I just said, "Oh, hello. Starting a master's in Reading, and maybe we could link up." And she replied, and she said, "Oh, that's funny. I'm starting a master's as well. What are you studying?" Now, Wikipedia tells me there are 174,000 people living in the town of Reading, and I had one person's phone number in my phone. And you've seen where this is going, but would you believe it? Turns out we were both starting this same, really quite niche course at the same university at the same time. Out of all of the thousands of people living in Reading, I had just found the only other Christian doing my course. And just to be clear, the friend who put us in touch had no idea. When I told her, she was completely surprised. And who knows, maybe that was a huge coincidence. But to me, in that time, when I was just feeling so anxious, it felt like God was saying, Hannah, I see you and I know you and I've gone ahead of you. So like I say, maybe you're here this evening and you've got some uncertainty on the horizon, or God is asking something of you and you think, I just don't know if I've got what it takes. Or maybe you're doing that thing, but you've got loads of imposter syndrome and you worry that you're not cut out for it. Well, I think if that is you, the message for you this evening is, has not the Lord gone ahead of you? You can have courage this evening, not because you have a brave disposition or you're a natural risk taker, but because you have a heavenly Father who goes before you and behind you and says that he will be with you even to the very end of the age.